Hi everyone, it's Emily from Minerva, and today we're going to be doing a sew along of the By Annie Catch All Caddy, which is this one here. So this is the perfect project for your craft supplies, sewing supplies, or even toiletries. It's got 3 pockets on one side, 2 on the other on the inside, and then we've got a zip pocket here and another slip pocket here, as well as slip pockets on both the front and the back. I've used cotton fabrics here. I've gone for a monochrome look with then the pop of the magenta for the binding. So whatever your favourite colour is, you could do the same, go for the monochrome, and then, for example, if your favourite colour is blue, you could change all the binding and the handles to the blue colour. So this is the pattern that we're going to be using, the Catch All Caddy. So don't forget to join the Minerva community. My favourite thing about the Minerva community is when I'm choosing fabrics, I always scroll down and people post their makes on there, what they've made with that fabric, and it gives you a good idea of what things look like in real life. Obviously, don't forget to share your makes as well on the Minerva community. Everything you're going to need for this project is listed, and if you've got any questions, then don't hesitate to ask. Let's get started. So here's the things you're going to need to make the Catch All Caddy. Obviously the pattern itself, and then here we've got 3 different types of fabric: the main fabric, the lining fabric, and the coordinating fabric, and you want a metre of each of those. I've gone for 2 pattern fabrics and then a plain fabric to contrast with it. You're then going to need some By Annie Soft and Stable, which is what I'm holding here, and then you're going to need some interfacing as well. You want some webbing, that's for the straps, and I've gone for black so it matches all nicely. And then you're going to need some rectangular rings, again for the straps, some coordinating thread, this is Gutterman thread, and then a zip as well. And it's a 9-inch zip that you're going to need. Other things that I'm going to be using at the moment as well is a ruler and a rotary cutter. You can also draw what you need on and use fabric. So I've sped this bit up here, but all I'm doing is, well, I first cut the selvage off and then I'm cutting out all the pieces that I need. The instructions for the sizes that you need to cut out are on page 2, and it will tell you what to cut out from the main fabric, the lining fabric, the coordinating fabric, and your interfacing and soft and stable. And then what I did, there's little check boxes on the pattern, and just check them off. You can see I've got my paper there with a pencil, and I'm just checking that off as I go. By using the mat as well underneath, I'm protecting my surface and also making sure I get very accurate measurements. So as mentioned, don't forget to cut out your soft and stable, which is what I'm cutting out here with the scissors, and I've marked that on with the ruler as opposed to using the rotary cutter, and do the same with your interfacing as well. For this section, I've took quilted set a lining fabric, placed it wrong side up, put the soft and stable on top, and then put quilted set a main piece on top of that with the right side up. And then just using either some chalk or an erasable pen, you want to draw on your quilted design. I've gone for like diamonds, so for that I've just done some diagonal lines and then done them around 2 inches apart and just joined that on. Obviously pop some pins into your fabric like I am here to stop it moving around so much. Then on your machine, I set my stitch length to a 3, as I always think if it's a stitch that's going to be seen, a longer stitch length's always nicer. and simply just sew on the lines that you have drawn on. I still reverse stitched at each side so that nothing came unravelled. I also made sure at this stage to keep smoothing down the fabric so I didn't get any unwanted lumps and bumps, especially on the underneath side where you can't see. You then want to repeat the quilting on the quilted set B and quilted set C. On page 3 of your instructions, it then tells you what you need to cut out from these quilted sets. So it will tell you from quilted set A, the pieces you need to cut out. So for example, quilted set A, we need to cut a side strip measuring 26¼ inch by 6½ inch. So that's what I'm doing here. And then from quilted set B, you're going to be cutting pockets A, B, C and D. Measurements are all on page 3. And on quilted set C, you're going to be cutting out the caddy front and back. And then it recommends that you stitch around all quilted pieces, so in an 1/8 of an inch from the edge to secure all the layers together and give it a good nice seal. Next we're going to prepare the handle units. So to do this we're going to press the bottom short edge in about 1/4 of an inch and do the same on the top edge. And then I'm going to fold this piece in half lengthways and give it a good press right on that centre crease. And then once we've done that, we're going to open that back up and then press each outer edge to the centre crease that we have just made. So if you make sure you give everything a really good press here, it's going to make the next bit a lot easier. Next, what you want to do is open one edge of the handle unit and place in your soft and stable piece that you've cut earlier for the handle. Pin or clip that together. The soft and stable in the handle is just going to make it a lot sturdier and it feels a lot nicer too. So clips here are always better, especially when you're working with something a little thicker, but you can also use pins. And then we're going to sew around all 4 edges. So here I believe I had it on a stitch length of 3 again. Again, going for the rule of if you can see your stitching, then do it at a longer stitch length, but we're going round one long edge to the short edge, up the other long edge, and then the last short edge. For this next bit, you want to place the handle out flat and mark in 5½ inches from each short edge. Then what you want to do, taking some clips or pins again, you're going to fold the middle section together so we're matching up the long edges, and you're only going to be sewing between the pen lines that you've just made. So you're essentially going to start 5½ inches in from one edge and you're going to finish off 5½ inches from the next edge. Obviously, again, you've got more bulk here, so if you feel the need to use a walking foot, you can. Just make sure you're only sewing from one 5½ inch edge to the other. And this is what you should be left with, which is like a twisted handle effect. So we're now working on the handle tabs, and there's 4 of these all together. So for this I've placed them right sides together, and I'd already pressed them in half down the middle lengthways. And you're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the long edge. Make sure you reverse stitch at the start, and then you want to reverse stitch when you get to the end of the seam too. So once you've done that, you want to turn it right sides together. If you need to use a bit of a loop turner here, you can. And once you've turned it right sides out, you want to press it and make sure the seam is on the centre at the back. And then using the webbing that we've cut out earlier to the correct measurements, and you want to push that through. Once you give it a little bit of a wiggle and get it going, it does get in there quite easy. And you want to push that so it's all the way down into the fabric, but you should have about 1 inch extra fabric on each end that the fabric exceeds the webbing, and this is exactly how you need it to be. Then on your machine, again with a stitch length of 3, we're going to sew all the way down both long edges of the handle tabs, just to secure that webbing in place, because obviously it does fit all the way in, but just to stop it turning or anything like that, we're going to stitch down both long edge just to secure it. Then taking one of your rectangular rings, you want to thread that onto the strap and fold it in half so the centre back seam's on the inside, and you're going to sew across the short edge to attach it together. Again, your machine should be okay with this because there's no webbing on this section, which is why this means that it's going to sew through that bit a lot easier, and especially later on when we come to attach it to the bag as well. We're now going to work on the bias binding, so using the square that you've cut out earlier, we're going to fold that in half, corner to corner, and then cut down the fold. So by folding it diagonally, corner to corner, we've created the 45-degree angle, which is what's required to make bias binding. Bias binding has a stretch to it in all ways and directions, which makes it perfect for binding bags. So once you've cut down the fold, you will now have 2 separate pieces that we're going to have to stitch together. The instructions for this is on page 1 if you want a diagram on how to do it. But we're basically, if you pop them like I've done here, so it kind of makes like a bit of a crown shape. And then what you're going to do is you're going to sew along that edge there using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, showing you just how it needs to be, right sides together if you're using pattern fabric, and then press that seam open. And then you want to decide how wide you want your bias binding to be. I always think the wider the better. You can either do it 2 1/4 inch wide or 2 1/2 inch wide. I decided on 2 1/2 inch wide just to give me a bit more leeway. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting 2 1/2 inch strips all the way along. Obviously we've made like a parallelogram. So you want to cut the 2 1/2 inch strips all the way along here until you've got no more fabric left, or fabric that isn't wide enough to cut another 2 1/2 inch strip. We now need to sew all these strips together, so I'm going to show you here exactly how you need to place it together. Remember, we're going right sides together, and we have got a right side now because we should have seams on some parts. So sew that together. If you need another diagram, it is on page 1 and it's figure D. But don't forget to reverse stitch. And what I did as well to make sure that it lined up perfectly, make sure you have like a triangle overhanging on each edge, and then that will line up as a strip perfectly. So keep doing this for all your strips until you're left with one big long bias binding strip. Over on the iron, you want to press all the seams open that you've just sewn, and then to turn it into bias binding, press it in half lengthways, give it a really good press on the fold, and then we're going to be using this later on to bind the bag and bind the pockets. Moving back to the handle units and the handle tabs that we've done earlier, taking the handle tab with the rectangular ring on, and then the handle unit, we're going to push the handle unit through the other side of the rectangular ring, and we're going to fold that up so it meets the stitching that we did, which is 5 1/2 inches away from the edge. To sew this together, we're going to sew in a box and then an X through to strengthen this seam. Instructions for this are on page 4, where there's diagrams of the box and the X, but obviously I will show you mine once it's done. Now that's done, you want to repeat the exact same thing with the other handle tab on the other side of the handle. We're now going to prepare pockets A and B. These measure 13.5 inch in length and 5 inch in width, and we're going to bind the top edge, which is a 13.5 inch strip. Place the bias binding on the top edge, so the raw edges of the bias binding are on the 13.5 inch edge, and you're going to sew this at around 1/4 of an inch, and you're going to sew all the way from one side to the other, reversing at each edge. I've just kept my bias binding in one long strip, and then I've just cut it down as I got near to that edge, just to make it a lot easier. So then what you want to do is you're going to turn it over to the other side, so the stripy side's my lining side, and you're going to fold it over so that that edge of the binding just covers the row of stitching that we've just done. So by making sure that it just covers that row of stitching, then from the front side your stitching should be right at the bottom edge of the binding. So obviously on this bit you can use pins or clips to hold it down if you prefer. I just was folding it along as I went on, because this way I feel like I've got more control over covering that row of stitching that I was talking about. And then this is what it should look like from the other side. So make sure you repeat that for pocket B, and then we're going to prepare pocket C in the same manner. So this is a smaller pocket, but we're going to bind that longer edge at the top, just in the exact same way as we've done pockets A and B. Now pocket D is the next one, and we're going to need a zipper foot on our machines for this, because this is the zipper pocket on the Catch All Caddy. So by putting a zipper foot on, we know we can get as close to the zip teeth as possible. So we're going to sew the zip onto the top long edge, and I'm going to place that right sides facing down on the top long edge. Obviously your zip is longer than the top edge, which makes it easier. So I'm making sure that the zip pulls on the left hand side, and then using some binding clips I'm going to hold that in place. Using the zipper foot, I'm getting as close to the zip teeth as I can, and then stitching down all alongside that side of the zipper tape, making sure I take the clips out as I go, and also making sure I reverse stitch at each edge. This is what it should look like once you've done. So you want to fold the fabric back and the zip back, so now you can see the front of your fabric, so the spotty side for me, and then your zip. I've now altered my zip length to a 3, because we're going to top stitch this fabric into place on the side of the zip. So stitch length of 3, and again using the zipper foot so I can get close to the zip teeth, I'm going to stitch all the way along the edge of the fabric and the edge of the zip, just to hold it on the right side. Now what we're going to do to the other side of the zip is actually bind it with the bias binding. So putting the raw edges of the bias binding on the top edge of the zip, and still using the zipper foot again to make sure you get as close to the zip teeth as possible. You're going to sew all the way along the edge of the bias binding and the zip teeth. And following the same principle as the top edge of the pocket, you're going to take the bias binding and you're going to move that to the back side of the zip, and you're going to sew it in place. So make sure you just cover the stitching that you've just done, and that way then your stitching on the front will be in the right place. Now we're going to work on divider A. So taking divider A strip and your fusible interfacing, we're going to fuse the interfacing to the wrong side of the strip. So divider A is 24.5 inches in length and 5 inches in width. Then you want to take divider A lining and pop this on top of the divider A main fabric, and you're going to pop them right sides together, matching the top edge and sides. The lining should extend about 3/4 of an inch beyond the main fabric on the bottom, and you're going to sew across the upper long edge. You then want want to give the seam a good press and make sure that you press it towards the lining. And then if you just generally want to give everything a good press like I have here, and then that'll set you up nice for the next stage. You then want to fold the pieces so that the wrong side's together. Match up the bottom edge like I'm just doing there and make sure you're holding onto that nicely, and then at the top edge give that a really good press, making sure you keep those bottom edges together. So when you turn that over to the other side, what that's going to have done is create a faux binding on the front. So obviously my main fabric is the spotty fabric, the stripy is my line, and as you can see there is some of that stripy fabric there at the top as a faux binding. Flip it back so that right side stays together, and you want to pin or clip the bottom edge that you've just held together, and we're going to sew along that edge. You now want to turn this tube so that the right side is out, and then give everything a good final press, making sure that you're putting that faux binding in place just as before. And once you've pressed the binding part in place, press all the way around. Then make sure the divider measures 25.5 inch wide, trim and cut off any excess if there is any. Then to hold everything in place, you're going to stitch in the ditch along the faux binding. So this is just on the edge of the binding, and then down the short edge, along the bottom and back up the other short edge. You want to repeat those steps that you've done in divider A on divider B. We're now going to work back on divider A, and we're going to create the bellowed pleats on this divider. You want to use an erasable pen, something that won't rub off easily. So chalk sometimes obviously rubs off easy. You're going to be making 6 marks altogether. You want to do a mark that's 9¼ inches from each side. So do it from one side and then the other, just like I am doing here. And then you want to do the same, but 7¼ inches from each side. And then finally, you want to do 1¾ inches from each side. You also want to make sure you're doing this on the lining side. So for me, that's the stripy side. Now we're going to flip over to the right side of the divider, and we're going to make 6 marks again. This time it wants to be in something that will rub off a bit more easily, because obviously you're going to be able to see this. So I've done chalk, but because the fabric's black anyway, that works out fine. So you want to do a mark that's 10¼ inch from each side, and then 2 more 6¼ inch from each side, and then finally 2¾ from each side. Finally, you want to do another mark that's 8¼ inches from each side, possibly in a different colour, because this is going to be a guide for attaching the divider to the caddy front. You can also use a pin in the marked line to distinguish it from the other lines. We're going to start working on the main fabric side. With your lining sides together, fold the fabric along the line that's 2¾ inch from the left. You want to stitch along this fold about 1/8 inch from the edge. So beginning at the bottom of the divider and stitch up to the top just below where your faux binding is. You then want to pivot your stitching, turn the work around and stitch back towards the bottom edge. Just in the same way, you want to fold your fabric again, but stitch along the marked line that's 2¾ from the right. And then you want to do the same with the 6¼ and 10¼ lines. Don't stitch on the 8¼ inch line. You should be left with something that looks like this, and we're now going to do the exact same thing on the lines on the lining side. So you're going to be placing the fabric right sides together, stitching at 1/8 of an inch on the marked lines on the lining side, up to the forebinding, pivoting and then stitching back down towards the bottom. This then creates the pleated divider. So make sure you have something that measures 13.5 inch wide, and then you're going to set it aside, give everything a good press. And as you can see, these create lovely pockets. You're going to repeat all that for the bellowed pleats on divider B. Instructions for this are on page 6, as the lines that you're going to draw are slightly different to create different size pockets. So make sure you check page 6, step D. Moving on to the side strip. So to get this ready, we're going to bind the 2 short edges. Using the same method as before, putting the raw edge of the binding up to the side, stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, reversing at each end, and then folding that fabric over, covering the line of stitching that we've just done, and stitching at the bottom edge of the binding. You then want to mark your pocket placement lines on the main fabric side. Mark vertical lines from the top to the bottom, which is 6 inch from each side. So as you can see, I've used chalk again because that shows up best on my black and white fabric, and I'm marking 6 inch from each side. We're now going to attach pockets C and D. So what I did here is pop them onto the placement line so I knew exactly how it was going to look. So as you can see here, one's the bound pocket, one's a zip pocket, and then flip them inwards so that then the fabric's right sides together. And we're going to stitch along the lines shown. So as you can see here, I've stitched them with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so when they're folded up, you can't see the seams. So with them folded up, using pins or clips, you want to clip the side edges in place because we're going to sew these down. Sew about 1/8 of an inch from the sides, and then you also want to sew along the bottom edge to keep that nice and flat, and you can sew that about 1/4 of an inch from the bottom fold. Make sure you don't stitch across the top because obviously that's a pocket. In the same manner for the sides, you're going to do the same for the zip pocket, which is pocket D, but this time you're going to start by sewing along the bound edge of the zip because we want to make sure the top edge of the zip gets sewn in place. So just take care at this bit because obviously you have got the zip there, but sew just along the top of the zip. Move the zipper pull out of the way should you need to, and if you find it easier to put a zipper foot on this bit as well, then you can. Once you get to the end of the bound edge, you're going to come down the side again at about 1/8 of an inch and then you're going to go across the bottom at about 1/4 inch, and then back up the last side and make sure you reverse stitch at the end. We're now at the stage where we can work on the final components. So this is the zipper pull. So this is a 1-inch strip, and what you want to do is you want to fold it into quarters. So this is a little tricky with it being such a small piece to begin with. So press it in half lengthways and open it back up so you have the centre crease, and then you want to press each outer edge towards that centre crease. Just obviously mind your fingers with this bit. Obviously because, like I said, it is a very thin strip. This is an optional step really. This bit is going to be attached to the zipper pocket, just as an easy way of getting in and out. And then while we're ironing, we're going to prepare the stabiliser sleeve, and we want to finish one short edge. So you want to turn the wrong side 1/4 inch and then another 1/4 inch like I'm doing here, and then we're going to take that over to the machine. So I'm going to sew all the way down the zipper pull strip, again just taking care because it is a thin strip. So from top to bottom on the open edge to sew it shut, reverse stitching at each side. And then you're going to do the same to finish off the stabiliser sleeve. You're going to sew close to that open edge from top to bottom just to finish that edge off. So then what you want to do with this is you want to fold it right sides together, and you'll end up with a piece then that measures 6 3/4 in width, and you're going to sew all the way down the 16-inch edge with about a 1/2 inch seam allowance. This piece here is basically for you to put maybe a piece of cardboard or some bag bottom in, and it's going to sit at the bottom of the bag and just again make it even sturdier. So this part is also optional too. You then want to take that seam that you've just sewn and place it in the middle. Press that seam open, and then you want to sew across the bottom raw edge, so the edge that you haven't finished off, and then clip your corners and then turn the right side out, and you can set that aside for the time being. Now going to work on the piece that's your caddy front. So you're going to bind one of the top long edges in exactly the same manner that we've done previously. Now mark the placement lines for the handles. So you're going to do this on the main fabric side of the caddy front, and you're going to mark 2 lines from top to bottom, 2 1/4 inch from each side. So I'm doing this with my chalk. And then you also want to do 2 lines on the back side using a marker that won't rub off easy, so I've switched to my erasable pen, and these are going to be 4 1/4 inch from each side. And then you want to draw a third line that's 3/4 inch from the bottom. So on the main side of the caddy front, we're going to put the handles that we've prepared earlier, and we're going to put them along the marks so that they're on the inside of the marks. So I've clipped along the bottom. You might find it difficult to pin through the handles themselves because of the thickness that we've got there. So we're going to sew across the bottom, and we're going to turn and sew up the side, making sure that you stitch on the stitching that's already there. And then you want to pivot across when you get 4 3/4 inches from the bottom. So I did make a little chalk line that you should be able to just see there. And once you've sewn across, you're going to stitch downwards. And if you make a mark that's 3.5 inches from the bottom, and then stitch across again, and then you're going to go across in a cross shape, and then back across the top edge to the corner, pivot and do diagonally again. So you've got basically a cross shape, and then back down the edge that you've not sewn on. Repeat those same steps to attach the other side of the handle. We're now going to attach divider A to the front panel. So this is the one with the 3 pockets. So flip everything so that you've got the lining side facing up. And if you remember earlier, we did a line that was about 3/4 of an inch from the bottom. You want to place the pocket dividers onto this line and get everything pinned in place so that the side edges are matching up and the bottom edge is on that line. Don't worry about any excess material that you're going to get sort of in the middle, because this is what's going to create more depth to your pockets. So pin or clip everything in place. Obviously you're not going to be able to clip the bottom, but you can pin the bottom in place. So if you remember, we did some lines that we didn't stitch earlier when we were doing the divider A. So these lines will match up with the lines that we've done on the lining side of the caddy front. So as well as stitching the side seams, we're going to stitch in between the pockets down that line so it matches up with the line on the caddy front, but on the lining side. We're now going to attach the front pocket A onto the front of the bag. So here what I'm doing is drawing 2 lines that measure 4 1/4 inches from each side. And that's on the main bag piece. And then I'm going to take the pocket A and place that on and clip the side edges and the bottom edges. I want to sew this in place using 1/8 inch seam allowance. Be careful not to catch your dividers that you've sewn onto the lining side because you don't want this affecting the use of the pockets. So sew down the edge, across the bottom and then back up the other side. And what I'm doing here is doing the 4 1/4 inch lines again from each side, because these are going to be the stitching lines. So again, making sure that you're not going to catch the dividers on the back, make it sure it's in the gap of the pocket dividers. Stitch up this line just up to the top of the binding, and then this is going to create pocket sections. What I've also done now, as you can see on the bottom edges, I've just rounded the corners off, so using a tool or template that you've got around the house just to round the corners off. So I've just marked the centre line on the caddy front, and I'm going to also mark the centre line of the side panel and bottom strip. So I've done it with a red mark, and I'm going to match these two red marks up so I know I've got everything equal, and I'm going to start clipping everything in place. So we're going to be attaching the front now to this long side strip. So this long strip here is going to become the base, and the sides, which we've attached the little pocket and the zip pocket on, if you remember. And obviously make sure that you match your bindings up on the side. So that was the next thing that I clipped in place before I began clipping and pinning around the curve of the caddy front. I find it easier to do it that way, and definitely clips are going to be 100% better here, as opposed to pins. Put in as many as you feel necessary. I'll be honest, the more that you put in, the easier it's going to be, but do the same on the other side. So taking it onto the machine now, we're going to stitch this in place. Now obviously we have got quite a lot of layers here. I found I was okay with my machine and a normal foot, but if you're struggling, if you get a walking foot, this is going to be much easier for you to sew through multiple layers. It'll sew through like butter. Like I said, I find I was okay, but regardless, just take it steady, especially when you're going around the corners, as obviously this is the fiddliest bit, as you can see here. I just kept stopping, keeping my needle in the down position, lifting the foot up, repositioning myself if I needed to, until I'd got all the way around the front of the bag. We need to bind this edge. So on the binding, all I've done is I've pressed in the top edge and I've finished it off, because obviously we need the top edge where we're going to start to be nice and neat. And again, in the exact same manner that we've done every bit of binding, making sure that raw edge is matched up with the raw edge of the bag, lining up the top edge. Again, we're adding more layers to this, so make sure you've got that walking foot on should you need it, and stitch it all the way around the bag, taking care when you go around the corners. The next step of sewing the binding on easier, what I did was take my fabric scissors and cut away any excess material, because obviously we've got foam stabiliser in here, so when you come to sew the other part of the binding, it'll fold over a lot nicer. So just as before, fold over the bias binding to the other side, just covering that stitching that we've just done and sewing along the edge of the bias binding. I know this bit is quite difficult to show, so I'll get the right angle on it, but just as we've done bias binding before. So you want to repeat the steps of attaching the caddy back and also getting your bias binding in place on the other side. So once you've attached the other side, this is what you should be left with. So it could be completed here, but if you remember earlier on, we created a sleeve like this. Now if you've got some bag base, you can use that like I have. This is like a plastic grid, or you could use cardboard either, and you just want to slip this inside. Make sure you cut it out just a little bit smaller than what you need. And then once you've done that, you can pop this in the bottom of the bag. This is a completely optional step, but it does give you more strength and structure to the bottom of your bag. It will then take a little bit more weight as well. As you can see, that's giving it a bit more structure. And that's your bag all completed. As mentioned previously, this is fantastic for all your craft supplies, sewing supplies, or even as a toiletry bag. You can be really creative with your fabric choices, using cotton fabrics, cotton poplins and polycottons, and do one similar to what I have, and you could just change the coloured binding. Don't forget to share your makes on the Minerva community so you can show everyone else what you've been sewing, and you can also show people what you've sewn with these fabrics too. So thank you very much for watching. Bye everyone.